Okay, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Some people might come kind of trickling in as we get started, but let's get the show on the road. My name is Brian Schwab, and I'm one of the community members helping to provide leadership for the Building of the Future Together process. Some of you are at our first meeting, and it's nice to see you again tonight. And for those of you coming for the first time, welcome. Thank you for your cooperation coming in tonight and sitting at different tables with the numbers. We just wanted to kind of diversify the group and get different opinions at different tables. So we really appreciate you doing that. And again, thank you for coming. This is a very important process, and we're looking forward to getting into the process with you. On your table is a sign-in sheet. If you have not signed in, please do that and make sure you fill in all the information. Also, please remember for future meetings to invite all your friends, family, members, anyone. Again, it's a very important process, so we want as many people to engage and come to the meetings as we possibly can have. So, as we go through the process tonight, you may have questions that arise in your group that we do not have time to address, or you may want to provide input on any aspect of the process. These questions and input do not have to be directly related to the topics we're studying, and that sheet is here and it's on the table that you've got there. Go ahead and fill it in the I have a question form, and we can turn it in at the end of the meeting, and we can address all of those in the future meetings and get feedback to all of you on those topics. Also, but just please take a few minutes to learn about the process online. There's a lot of information on the websites and out amongst Batavia to help spread the word again. It's very important for us that as many people get engaged in this process as we're moving forward. So, and now I'm going to introduce Kelly, who will talk a little bit about what we're going to accomplish in tonight's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so if you were at our first meeting, we went through the general orientation and became familiar with the community engagement process. Following our orientation, we rolled up our sleeves and began to work in our small groups. One of the first tasks was to identify the key questions and topic areas we need to address to develop an implementation plan for the Educational Facilities Master's Plan. We were impressed with how productive you all were with the work session, and we used that information from the Building Our Future Together course of study over the next few months. We have documented all of your work in that session and have a QR code that will lead you to all the documents. And please take a look at tonight's materials and let me point out some of the items you will see. Each of you have an agenda with a QR code and a paper copy of tonight's work activity. You will find one set of materials at your table for the group to share, but everyone can use the QR code to access the electronic version. The first item is a document that contains the verbatim responses from each small group activity at our first meeting. From those verbatim responses, we have created the next document, which is an executive summary. Also included is the general consensus points. These are the points of general agreement from all the work groups at the meeting. The next document is a copy of this evening's informational PowerPoint presentation. The last document contains the guiding principles and planning parameters for our Educational Facilities Master Plan's planning process. These were developed by a team of staff and community members as they worked through a 2-year-long journey to understand our current and future facility needs. These guiding principles were the result of reviewing data from a number of sources, including shadowing students, focus groups with staff and students, time studies, facility assessments, and community engagement around specific topics such as sustainability. We will continue to reference this important document as we finalize our implementation plan. Again, all of this information is also available on the Building Our Future Together website. So tonight, we are going to delve into our district's finances. We have officials from here at the district and from their financial advisors, PMA. They are going to give us some basic information about school funding, how we could fund updates to our buildings, and a few financial scenarios of how these updates could impact our local property taxes. We did make a few small scheduling changes. We will now have our last 2 sessions on March 10th and March 24th. In April, we will invite even more community members to provide feedback of the implementation of the plan at a series of community open houses. Then, in May, we will make our presentation to the board. One thing we would like you to keep in mind is that tonight we are here to learn about the budget and finances. At our next session, March 10th, we will dig into the details of our educational master's facility plan, including the estimated costs for the different projects we'll discuss. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the team of presenters tonight. Superintendent Dr. Lisa Hitchens, our Chief Financial Officer Tony Glacy, and Bob Lewis with PMA Securities, who provides financial planning services to the district.
Thanks, Kelly. Bob and Tony will be up here in a minute, but I am going to show you the agenda for this evening. I'm going to just make a few comments as a follow-up from our first session, and then Tony and Bob will present about our fiscal responsibility, our bonds, and our funding options shortly. Kelly explained about our process last time, and you can find the verbatim questions and comments that everyone had. And there were some key takeaways from that first session about topics that everyone said they wanted to hear more about. So today, we're going to cover some of those, but we can't get to all of them tonight. So the topics at the bottom of this screen would be in the next section, or the next two sessions. One of the, reading through the comments, you're going to see that one of the biggest surprises for many of you that were at the first session was the current condition of our buildings. How did the buildings get to the point where they need this much repair? And I want to take this opportunity to talk through the process that we use to maintain and improve our buildings. Our district, in case you don't know, we currently operate out of 10 buildings. We have this high school, we have a middle school, 6 elementary schools, a maintenance facility, and our central office on Wilson Street. Because of the volume of needs and working with a limited budget, we need to plan carefully. So what we do is we use a capital projects team, and that team is made up of staff and citizens, and they are tasked with developing a capital projects plan annually. Their process begins with identifying and categorizing all projects, and then what they do is they code the projects into different categories. Some of the projects are required of us so that we can be compliant with safety standards that are set by the law or school code. The second type of project is general maintenance. The team does things like monitors the life cycles of systems like the HVAC, the roofing, parking lots to ensure that those items are on their radar. And keeping up with those routine replacements reduces the likelihood of emergency repairs. And the final category are projects that are improvements that enhance our facilities, infrastructure, or programs. So that's the first step. They make their list, and then you can see the budget steps in, and so the committee looks at their budget and determines how many projects they can complete in the year or over the course of several years. It's a several-year plan. Parking lots, technology servers, roof replacements, these things really add up, especially given the number of facilities that we have. So even though next year the Board of Education is budgeting almost $3 million for our capital projects, not all the projects can be funded. The committee prioritizes the projects, and then they make a decision about which they can fund and which they need to defer. Our current reality has us completing priority maintenance projects, deferring other maintenance, and improving very little. We are unable to make actual improvements that better support student learning. If given the opportunity to catch up, we can lower our long-term operations costs and make our facilities more cost-effective and efficient. You're here tonight because we have developed a master plan that addresses both maintenance and improvements, and you're going to be following this process as well. So we'll share the master plan in the coming sections, but tonight you're helping with that budget piece of it. We need your input on the financing and the prioritization of the plan. Our goal is to increase the likelihood that future committees can shift their focus from only the compliance and the bigger projects to maintaining more things and improving. So now I will turn it over to Tony.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So carrying that conversation forward about why we are where we are with our facilities in terms of maintenance and improvements, one of the major reasons as to why that is the case is the Great Recession. And to get through the Great Recession, we had to make a lot of hard choices. And at the time, to get through it, we had to reduce staff, froze salaries and pay for a number of years. We cut program budgets, and in some years we spent more money than we took in, so we deficit spent. And that took a toll on our fund balances. And of course, we had to severely limit what we were investing into our schools at the time. But we knew as we were going through those cuts, and they were very challenging conversations and figuring out what we were going to do, we knew that the outlet mall TIF was going to expire. The outlet mall, as you know, down on Farnsworth Road by the tollway on I-88, was in what's called a tax increment finance district. And so the taxes that were generated by properties in that particular district were going to the city of Aurora to redevelop that space. And that's why it was attractive for the outlet mall to build there, because a lot of the infrastructure that was needed to build the outlet mall, their taxes for a period of years went into establishing that infrastructure. But when that TIF expired, being that the school district is, as I like to say, the biggest pig at the trough when it comes to taxes, a lot of that money came to us. So the property taxes, the outlet mall always paid its property taxes, but for a period of time it went toward that particular district, and now it comes to us. We knew that we would get about $3 million a year once that TIF expired, and if we could make it to that point, then we were going to be okay. And when that finally happened, we took that money and divided it into 3 buckets. The first bucket went to reducing class sizes and improving our instructional support. The second bucket went into our capital projects, especially the backlog that we had endured as to get through that recession, and then also to restore fund balances because we had been deficit spending for a period of years. So here is a indication of where we were with capital projects. Then we were spending not much more than a couple $100,000 on in our schools, and given that we have significant square footage and costs related to maintaining our schools, $200,000 is just a drop in the bucket. In fact, what we're spending now, frankly, is a drop in the bucket. But with that, those monies coming back online, we're able to spend more. And as things have improved for us, we've been able to spend even more. Now we're spending close to $2.5 million. In next year, will be close to $3 million a year on our facilities. As to how we compare with other communities, this is a comparison of tax rates of the school districts in Kane County. There happen to be 9 unit school districts in Kane County. And Kane County is a bit of an anomaly. If you go one county to the east, in DuPage County, there's almost probably 100 school districts there, and they're of different types. There's elementary districts, there's high school districts, and there's unit districts that serve K through 12. Kane County has 9 K-12 unit districts, and that's all there is. So it makes it a little easier for us to compare apples to apples in this particular area. Here you see that in terms of tax rate, Batavia is the 3rd highest. In terms of equalized assessed value per pupil, so this is looking at the amount of tax base behind each student in each of these school districts, Batavia is the 3rd highest. And so this is a good indication as to how much money a local school district can generate to fund its schools. So people often say, well, Batavia is high tax, and indeed it is. That's how things work, unfortunately, in Illinois. It's a regressive system where the state, unfortunately, doesn't provide much support, although things have changed in recent years with a new funding formula, where they're providing funding more for districts in need that don't necessarily have property wealth behind each student. That's where their money is going. And for us now, That means that there's very little support that will come from the state of Illinois when it's going to go to the other school districts almost entirely first. This is an indication of our funding adequacy, and so this is what generates that state support. And so the state in 2020 determined that we were at 96% adequacy in terms of the funding that we have per student in Batavia. And so the school districts that you see on the left, they're the ones that would receive the state funding. The school districts on the right don't. They would still get state funding, but they will not get more state funding than they're getting. And this is a breakdown of the per student revenue by source of each of these 9 school districts. And in this case, it's sorted by local property taxes. And so you'll see here, Batavia is second in terms of the local property taxes that are devoted on a per student basis relative to the rest of the school districts in Kane County. And you can see too, the red bars are state funding, and then the yellow bar is federal funding. So they're relatively close. We're getting closer to equity between schools because it was much worse in previous years. But you can see where those sources of funding come from. It's highly dependent on the zip code, quite frankly. And so getting through that Great Recession for us, it was difficult for Batavia. This is now not a comparison anymore. This is just Batavia's profile score history from 2013 to 2020. So the State Board of Education does an evaluation of each school district's finances, and it gives them a grade, essentially. And our grade wasn't very good there in 2013 and 14, and it got terrible in 2015 as we were coming through the other end of the recession. In fact, we were in what's called warning status, and if you're on warning status for a number of years, in fact, the State Board of Education can come in and take over your school district, basically supplanting the local school board, and they make the decisions for you because your finances were so terrible. But luckily, we've been able to get our financial house in order in these last few years. We've earned recognition status, and that's primarily because our revenues are more than our expenditures. And this gives a little bit more of that history. So the last 5 years, the blue bars being the revenues and the green bars being expenditures. We want those blue bars to be taller than the green bars. And then across that slide there, you see a yellow line, and that's our fund balances. And the fund balances of how much money we have basically at the end of the school year left over. And you can see that that number is increasing, which is a good thing because in prior years, our fund balance was so low. One of the reasons why our financial scores were low is that we didn't have enough money to make it through the school year. In fact, we had to borrow money in the form of what's called tax anticipation warrants, kind of like a payday loan in a way, where we borrow millions of dollars, in some cases $8–10 million, so that we can pay all the bills that come due, pay payroll and all those other sorts of things before the property taxes come in. And talking with my colleagues, nobody could believe that a community like Batavia would ever have to issue tax anticipation warrants to get through a school year. And luckily, our fund balance has improved to the point where we don't have to issue tax anticipation warrants anymore. In the last 3 years, we haven't had to do so, but for the prior 30 years, as best I can tell, we did. And so we're in much better shape than we used to be. So our financial condition as a school district is much, much better than it was. In fact, it'd be the best that it has been in the entire history of Batavia. And the primary reasons for it are we have much better fund balances, and we have sufficient cash on hand where we can actually pay our bills. We've reduced our bond debt, and in fact, we did a refunding or kind of refinance some bonds to take advantage of lower interest rates, and also earlier this year, we actually have an upgraded credit rating. So we're now at AA plus by S&P, and that's the second highest. And just like your own personal credit rating, this is good for us because it means that when we borrow money in the future, it will likely be at lower interest rates because we're not as much of a credit risk. So before I hand it over to Bob, I just want to tell you about potential funding sources when it comes to funding our master plan. There's basically 4 different places money can come from to fund things like this. That's fund balance. These are good expenditures for fund balance because they're one-time expenses. They don't continue onward. You wouldn't want to use fund balance or deficit spend to pay your staff because those costs compound over time, and that means they get a structural deficit or a structural problem in your finances. You can use operating funds. So kind of a pay-as-you-go. So we've got some room in your budget. That's what we're doing right now. We saw we're paying more and more toward capital projects. As we have more room in our budget, we take more. We take advantage of that and take care of that backlog. But you can also finance some of those costs where you can get a lump sum of money up front, but you pledge your operating budget over a period of years, probably 5, 10, 20 years to pay back that loan essentially. It's possible, it's not necessarily something that you would choose to do if you didn't have to. And then the third form of funding source is a referendum. So referendum means we go to the taxpayers and ask them if they agree to invest in our schools, and that would be funded by increased property tax levy. And then lastly, there's a state construction grant, which as a matter of fact, Illinois offers to school districts. And we were the recipient of when we built Bracement Lane and Hoover Woods School. But it is about 15, maybe 16 or 18 years backlog, and so the districts that were approved that long ago are still waiting for their funds, and so it's highly unlikely that we would be able to rely on anything of that sort going forward. So I'm going to have Bob now talk a little bit about school bonds.
So what is a bond, and more specifically, what is a referendum bond? So school districts issue municipal bonds to finance capital projects generally. City halls, park district facilities, roads, bridges, school buildings. They're very similar to a home mortgage in that a bond is paid pursuant to a fixed schedule, and it has a time at which it needs to be paid. Municipal bonds are oftentimes so designated as being tax exempt. What that means is the investors who buy the bonds from school districts do not have to pay taxes on the interest that's paid to them. So they're willing to buy the bonds at a lower rate of interest to the benefit of the school district, park districts, any type of governmental entity that sells tax-exempt bonds. Referendum bonds are payable from a separate property tax levy. So a little bit more about the tax levy. So the tax levy is extended by units of government to pay for a variety of purposes. For school districts, that's education fund, O&M fund, transportation fund. Those are usually the three biggest. Together, those are called the operating funds. And then the bonds have a completely separate tax levy that is only dedicated to repay the bonds. So that leads into that last bullet point that just lets you know if the voters approve a referendum bond, the proceeds of that can only be used to pay for the capital projects. It can be used for supplies, salaries, transportation, or any other operating expense. It has to be used for capital projects. So what about the prior referendum bonds of the district? The current bond and interest payment on a $350,000 home is about $750 each year of your tax bill, if your home value is around that amount. Over the last 12 years, the district has undertaken several refinancings to lower the interest rates on its bond to the tune of saving taxpayers $8.5 million. So that annual payment would be higher if it were not for the efforts to reduce the amount of interest that's paid. So here's a graphical representation of the final payments of the district's bond issues. There's 3 remaining full years. So that first blue bar will be for taxes collected this summer, followed by 2 more consecutive years at that same amount, and then a partial year in the 4th year. So that structure is what provides an opportunity for the district and its constituents to look at the possible options that it has to fund its capital needs. Similar to a household, when we're in a situation when you're about to pay off your home mortgage or home equity loan or something along those lines, and you have a choice of what do I want to do now if those funds get freed up? Do I want to go ahead and do some more improvements in my home, or do I just want to free up those funds in my budget? However, that's where the analogy breaks down because there's some restrictions on the bond and interest levy. As I mentioned a little earlier, districts levy taxes for operating purposes and its referendum bond purposes. So that dedicated property tax can only be extended if there's previous referendum bonds outstanding. So when the referendum bonds are paid off, that property tax goes away. The district can't simply take those taxes and reallocate it to other purposes, like we would as a household. As a household, you pay off your home mortgage, you can then redirect that money in your budget to other projects or needs or whatever it is you want in your household budget. A school district can't do that when the referendum bonds mature. That money goes away unless the voters were to approve it again. So here's another chart for you to look at, and this chart is giving you an idea of where the municipal bond market is at. So just like a household pays an interest rate, a fixed interest rate on its mortgage or car payment, school districts pay a fixed interest rate on its municipal bonds. The rate of those bonds depends upon the underlying conditions and economic forces that are at play at the time that the bonds are sold, just like it is with your home mortgage. Many of us took advantage of low home mortgage rates last year after the COVID pandemic set in. And if you've been following that at all, you know mortgage rates have been going up. And the same thing has been happening in the municipal bond market. The blue line represents an index called the MMD. And we use that in the municipal bond market to monitor trends that are taking place in interest rates for municipal bonds. Similar to the Dow Jones Industrials is utilized in the equity markets, and home mortgage rates are used in that market. So from a historical perspective, you have 20 years worth of data here, and you can see over that 20-year period, interest rates are still near lows from that in that period of time. In fact, if you have more data, additional data would just show that rates are still at historic lows. Now, we have been coming off those lows, just like in the mortgage market, and that has been tied to expectations for Federal Reserve policy and expectations for CPI. So the gray area represents the federal funds rate. If you follow economic news at all, you know there's been a lot of focus on what the Federal Reserve is going to do. So that gray area chart represents the federal funds rate at any point in time. And while it has been 0 to 0.25% ever since the pandemic started, the Fed is anticipated to increase rates starting in March and then 0.25% probably every meeting thereafter. And markets don't wait to react until the Fed actually does something. They anticipate and start moving in anticipation what the Fed might do, and that's why you're starting to see rates already go up. So speaking of those underlying market conditions, CPI and how it impacts municipal bond markets, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out the CPI. They also put out other measures of inflation. One of those is called the Producer Price Index, or PPI. This graph you see here is a subset of the PPI. It specifically focuses on construction costs. This is a data set that goes back several years, so I've only shown you like the last 20 years here. And you can see at various times it has gone up, but nothing like it has gone up here as a result of the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of debate as to what is the underlying causes of inflation. Pretty much a lot of people really agree that the COVID pandemic has had a lot to do with that, especially with the supply bottlenecks. There's also some debate as what the federal stimulus that we had last year has done to that, with all that money flowing into the system. But the takeaway from that is the cost of doing construction projects is increasing, which can have an impact then on the cost to build school buildings. So here's a separate index that they put out that specifically focuses on the cost of school buildings. And this is the entire data set. So this one isn't as long as PPI or CPI or the other one that I just looked at. This is the entire data set. So you can see in the Great Recession, we actually had an increase in this index. And then it was rather steady afterwards. And then more recently, again, following along what we saw on the prior slide, the cost to build school buildings has increased. So why is this important? Yes?
That chart's very blurry to read, and even on the printouts you've given us. Can you tell us the values that are on the X and the Y axis? It looks like the bottom ones are years, and then it looks like, is that square footage?
No, so the bottom ones are years, And the other axis is an index. So like when you hear the CPI being reported, like last year's CPI was 7%, what that is a change in the underlying index. So the index for CPI at the beginning of the year was like 207. And at the end of the beginning of the year was like 270. At the end of the year, maybe it was like 280 something. And it's the change in the index, which is what you hear reported in the news. So that y-axis then is the index. So it's not the rate of change in the index, which you normally hear. So what they do is they create a market basket of goods at the beginning, and then they track that market basket of goods as time goes on. So as that number gets higher, it's representing an increase in the cost of building the school building.
So does that mean on the far left-hand side, it looks like it's 100, the index is 100, and then at the very far end on the right-hand side, it looks like it's about 200. Does that mean that the cost of construction has doubled in those across that number of years?
Yes, that's what this index is saying.
Okay.
So, what's the importance of this then? It has an impact then on the district's plans for funding its capital projects, because as Tony's going to go over here in a little bit, one of the objectives in the scenarios we have is to potentially not increase the overall bond levy. Well, when you have the goal to not increase the overall bond levy, it's similar to like if you were, as a household, said, well, I want to buy a new house, but I want to keep my monthly mortgage payment the same at $1,500, let's say. Well, if interest rates go down, I can buy a bigger house because I'm targeting $1,500 payment. If interest rates go up, then I have to buy a smaller house. So it's the same thing with the goal to maintain the annual bond payment. If interest rates rise, that's going to take away the amount of projects you can do. But it's also true as the cost of construction rises, you're not going to perhaps be able to do as much as the district may want to do with this program. So these are obviously variables that are a state of flux, but they're ones that are important for the decisions that have to be made.
Thank you, Bob. So delve now into some funding options. So, but before we do, you saw this, actually, let me ask you a question. How many were here at the last session? Just by show of hands. Oh, excellent. Wow, that's fantastic. So this side you saw a couple weeks ago, and it breaks out kind of the objectives of the things that overall we'd like to accomplish with our master plan by level. And then this slide you also saw last time, and it breaks out kind of the categories and examples of projects. And here, if you recall, last time I talked about operational costs and maintenance and improvements, and then functional costs and maintenance and improvements. This kind of breaks that out, just to give you a kind of a way of thinking about things. And so, operational, safety and security, accessibility, warm and dry. And I would throw maybe even like some convenience factors in there too, because we know that traffic is an issue around our schools, and parking and those kinds of things. Like those would all be examples of operational things. And then when it comes to functional, it'd be things that would improve our programs, our educational programs, or our co-curricular, extracurricular programs, those sorts of things, and experiences for students. So all right, before we get into the options, a couple of things that I just want to know. That everything here is estimated. And I estimate it, when I'm estimating something, I generally indicate it with a tilde. So that's that kind of squiggly symbol. And then when we talk about impacts to taxes, the number that I'm using is always relative to the median home value in Batavia, which as of today, in the current market, is $350,000. So that's a market rate home value. And then also, too, all the options consider a construction timeline from 2025, which is when our bonds would expire and we could potentially do something, through about 2030. All right, so just a recap of those funding sources of where the money could come from. Fund balance, operating funds, referendum, and not really state construction grant. And then as we go through these options, there's a few things that you should consider. There are some costs for construction, and so that would be like phasing and displacement of students. And so think about it, if you were renovating your kitchen, for example, you kind of tear apart your kitchen, it almost makes your home inhabitable, and you had to move out for a time. and you had to maybe rent a hotel. That would be considered a sunk cost. The cost that goes into renting the hotel for your family would be considered a sunk cost, meaning it's necessary to get the construction done, but it actually doesn't help you get the construction done. And there's a lot potentially of that depending on how we go about this. As you're renovating schools on a massive scale, there has to be a place for those students to be. And in some cases, you have to get mobile classrooms and bring those in, which are extraordinarily, very expensive. Or you have to ship them to another school to educate them for a time, which is also exceptionally expensive and increasing quite rapidly these days. There's also construction escalation costs, and we're undergoing at this present time the highest construction escalation costs in history when it comes to school building. So it is a major factor over as well. There's the future bond market rates, which Bob was talking about. We're at historic lows, but we don't know what's going to happen in the upcoming years. And if you do, I'd love to talk to you. I have some investment opportunities we can consider. And then also there's matching project costs with funding inflows. And so some of these projects are quite large and expensive. And depending on how funding comes in, we might not have enough cash to undertake them, especially if we're looking at using operating funds to do that. We might have to save money as a school district and through operating funds, kind of bank it away so that we can afford larger projects. And lastly, there's that balance between the operational and the functional. Unfortunately, the mode that we're in right now and have been, and will likely continue to be, is that we can only take care of the maintenance. And those are all operational concerns. We can't necessarily get to the point where we're improving the functions and the things that we bring students here to do, is to learn and make that experience better. All right, so here's the first option. Option A, no changes. The sources of option A in terms of funding is operational budget and fund balance. Its timeline is 5 years, but it can only accomplish basic maintenance and most safety and security upgrades that we've identified. It doesn't take care of any functional improvements because there's not enough money to do so with the operational budget and fund balance. And it doesn't require a referendum necessarily. We don't have to ask the voters to do that. But if we did go to referendum and that referendum failed, this is where we would be. We would have to use operational budget and fund balance. The cost is about $40 million, note the tilde. And the tax impact is minus $750 because bond debt, as Bob described, goes away in 2025. And that would save the average, or the median home value, the average taxpayer in Batavia, not quite average, but the median home value in Batavia, about $750 a year. So here's a picture of that debt schedule, and it's exactly as what Bob showed earlier. We have about $9 million that we pay each year toward bonds and interest. That goes away in 2025. 2026, we're debt-free. We paid it off. Nothing fills in behind it. And here's what would happen to our tax rate. So in the prior slide, you saw that we were on the right end, or the third district in terms of tax rate. We would drop to second to last. Now, these are tax rates in 2020, and of course, things will change, and all school districts pay off debt at different rates, and all different sorts of things happen. Their EAD grows at different rates, and things happen in different school districts, so there's no guarantees. This is just an estimate, but if things being as they are today and our tax rate changed, this is what it would look like. Option B is to maintain the bond and interest levy. We call it BNI. So that's the money that's dedicated, the taxes that are dedicated to paying off those bonds. So we would replace the current bond debt at the same level that we have now. We'd use our operational budget like we would in option A, and we would use our fund balance as we would in option A. But we'd have to take 2 bites at the apple. We'd have to break these projects into 2 phases. The first phase would start in 2025 and probably carry through 2030 or thereabout. But we would have to defer a lot of work until 2035 at least, because we wouldn't have enough to get it done. It would affect all schools from an operational standpoint, and most schools from a functional standpoint. So we'd be able to get the majority of the identified projects done, but we would have to defer work at Ellis Gustafson and J.B. Nelson School, those 2 schools in particular. We'd put enough money into them that we'd get another 10 years of use out of those 2 particular schools, but then in 2035, we would probably have to come back to the voters and talk about what we would need to do with those schools to move forward. It does require a referendum because it requires a bond debt. You can't issue bond debt a referendum on debt without voter approval. And it would cost something in the neighborhood of about $180 million. And its tax impact is zero. And of course, taxes go up every year because of inflation, and there's other factors, of course, too, depending on how your home is assessed. But basically, it's the same taxes as we have today, same path as we go now. The bond schedule, the old bonds are in blue, but they would, that difference between blue and the current payment level, that $9 million, would be filled in with new bonds and are represented in green. So we carry that payment forward about another 20 years.
Can I ask a question? What were the initial bonds issued for? In that previous slide, what we owe is what?
Yeah. So with the blue bonds, you're asked, the question is, what bonds were they issued for?
Yeah, were they-
Primarily, they were for the
amount.
The amount.
1.5 million or something?
I don't recall the amount. The project was mostly the high school, and then there was a lot of work elsewhere.
9.5 million, I'm pretty sure is what we did.
I
So we owe 9?
There's about, let's see, probably $30 million, a little in that neighborhood remaining for what we have to pay. But of course, when you borrow money, you don't just borrow the principal, you're paying back interest, and then when you pay it over a period of time, it gets expensive, and so you want to minimize that to the extent that you realistically can. And our operating tax rate in this particular scenario remains the same, basically, and so we would still be where we are, basically third in the county in terms of the tax rate. And so option C here is to increase the bond and interest levy. So more bond debt than we currently have today, plus the operational budget and the fund balance we've seen in the previous scenarios. But we could accomplish almost all the work in a single phase. And so it would start in 2025 and end in about 2030, be able to tackle the operational aspects, we'd be able to tackle the functional aspects. Of course, it certainly would require a referendum, and the cost would be about $250 million. And the tax impact to the median value home property in Batavia would be about $370. So here's what that debt schedule looks like. Blue bars being the old debt, green now stands prouder than the blue by about 50%. And tax rate goes up by 0.35 by 0.35, but we're still in the same position in terms of tax rate relative to the others. All right, so here's a recap of all the options together. So option A is no change. In all cases here, we're talking about 5 years of construction. But for an operational standpoint under option A, it's just basic maintenance kind of going along as we are now, and we would do our very best to take care of all the safety and security projects that we've identified. But there wouldn't be enough money to go beyond that. It would just be nothing in terms of functional. So nothing that enhances the programs and experiences that we currently have from a facility standpoint. It costs about $40 million. It would save taxpayers $750 on a median value. Option B, 2 phases, defers work for JVN and Gustafson, but we'd be able to take care of all their operational aspects in other schools and functional aspects. Cost would be about $180 million, no tax impact, relatively speaking. And then option C, single phase, we tackle the vast majority of the project. We've identified about $350 million worth of projects that we would like to do, but this would tackle about $250 million of that. So it certainly doesn't do everything, but it gets us reasonably close to what we would like to accomplish. That cost would be to the taxpayer about $370. So what does it mean for our guiding principles, which we've shared at the tables? You review what those are, but the team that was looking at this set, before we kind of delved into this work, we set guiding principles in terms of what we wanted to accomplish. And this is a summary of how much progress we make in those areas, divided out both into the operational and the functional. See a lot of yellow and red under option A, green and yellow under option B, and then green under option C. So that will bring us into our small group work activity.
Can I ask a question before you leave?
Yeah.
When you talk about the costs, and you said 180 million and 250 million from the two different options, does that include the interest repayment back, or is that just the money that's going to go into building the schools or constructing and renovating?
Yeah, that's the money that would go into building the schools.
And
And-
what
and
would
the-
what would the interest be then?
The interest, it depends on what we issue, and so that, depending on the size of the interest, is factored in there in terms of, that's the capacity that we would have, and all assumptions holding true, to construct. And if it was more than our assumptions, then, we would have less money to build. That's what it would boil down to. But Bob can
So you're
figure
saying,
out
though that those costs do include the interest then? It's just not the cost?
No, the annual payment includes the principal and the interest, but the number, the 180 million is a construction cost. I think 40 million of that's coming from fund balance, and where there would be no borrowing associated with that scenario, is about $140 million borrowing. Depending on interest rates, usually you pay back in interest. If you're doing a brand new referendum bond, usually the amount of interest you can pay back is about 50% of what you borrow. So if you borrow 140 million, you're probably going to pay about $70 million in interest.
Well, then your years aren't right.
My what sound
Your
right?
years aren't correct. You're saying $10 million over 20 years, which is $200 million. You're saying 180 of that is going to go into the building of the schools, but you got another 180 that's going to go into interest. So that's a total payment back of 360.
No, there's $180 million in principal. The amount of interest you pay back, 150% of your borrow, so that's the principal plus the interest. So you pay back, in that estimate, 140 plus 70, that's 210. When it's 20 years, each financing is done in 20 years, so we're assuming the financings are staged over a period of time, that you don't borrow all $140 million at once. When you do this large of a project, you borrow what you need when you need it, and each bond issue goes out 20 years. So they're issued, the concept plan has them issued in phases once every 4 years. So each financing goes out 20 years when it's sold.
So it won't end in 2046.
Maybe not necessarily, but I'd be happy to talk with you more about it. So, but these are it's a good point in the sense that these are concepts and estimates. That's why I put that tilde everywhere.
Well, that's what I
It might not
understand,
shake
Chris.
out. But I'd be happy to talk to you about it and answer your questions, so we're
Well, let
not
me
taking
just
too much
finish my
time.
comment, please. I'd like to come out. Your chart says it's paid off in 20 years, 2046. But that's not true if you're not borrowing the money all at one time. It's going to go out probably to 2060 instead of 2046. You don't know,
No,
but
but
No, the state law says you can only go out 20 years on a school bond financing. So if the last financing is like in 2025, 26, 27, you can only go out 20 years from that point.
I'd be happy to answer your questions, Bob. I promise. But so
That's my question.
we don't want to deviate here. We want to make sure that we give folks time to actually complete the tasks at hand, and we can get that feedback, because that's why you guys are here. So thank you for being here this evening. But if you do have questions, I'd be happy to talk about it with you offline. Thank you.
All right, thanks for all that good information. Now it's time for you to get to work. On your table on the green paper is tonight's work activity. This is the official sheet for your recorder to use. Let's go through the instructions to make sure everyone understands what they need to do. First, each table group needs to select a recorder and a facilitator. The recorder is responsible for completing the worksheet. Make sure to fill in the information in the box in the upper left-hand corner too. The facilitator should facilitate discussions, keep the group focused so the work is completed on time, and then report table results when we share ideas at the end of tonight's session. Please make sure that the information recorded on the group's worksheet reflects general agreement of everyone at the table, not just the opinion of one or two individuals. Monitor the time to make sure your group finishes on time. We'll attempt to start reporting out at about 8 o'clock, gives you about 40 minutes of work time. At the end of the session, we will only collect the green worksheet that's been completed by the recorder. As you jump into tonight's work activity, please remember that at future community engagement sessions, we will provide an overview of the BPS 101 Education Facility Master's Plan and associated cost. Our goal in the end is to provide a plan to implement this plan here in Batavia. Take a minute or two to review the 3 tasks, and then let's get to work. If you have questions about the work activities, just contact a member of the facilitating team member who will be circulating around the room. Thank you. Get to work.
What we're going to do now is we're going to hear from the tables, each table. Kelly is going to walk around and she's going to come to the table and ask you each to talk on a few topics. What we're going to ask you to do is tell us about one pro, one con from each of the options that you have written down, and then one additional piece of information. So we want to be brief, but give one of each of those from each table. And then lastly, share your option of what your table chose, and choose one speaker. So Kelly, I'm going to let you go and get started with the table out there. Just project yourself. We don't have an actual mic to walk around, so please project as you are out there speaking. Go ahead, Kelly. Go ahead.
For our group, task 1 for option A, the pro, we listed as low cost, lower taxes. The con that we selected was expectation of reduced home value when the school's falling into disrepair. For option B, at least for a pro, we wrote at least some positive action being taken to improve the school system. For a con, the deferment of ADS and A. Nelson, the deferment of those two will have a much higher cost for those in the future. Option C, for pros, for just over $30 a month for the median household, we can all have schools drastically improved. And for cons, managing this kind of a project at that short time frame is an enormous task to take on. It would be very difficult to manage. Additional information, just
one. Yep, please.
Who makes decisions on the order of which building goes first for whatever option is chosen? And for task 3, we chose option C.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I don't need them. Get out of here with that. I appreciate it, but no.
Okay, so option A, one pro we all identified was the tax aid. The homeowners tax aid. One con was we're deferring problems, kicking the can down the road. Option B, pro that we agreed on was no tax increase. And kind of the operational things we get to do. One con would be just deferring some things down the road. Option C, the big benefit is it's like the Cadillac, we get everything. But the con would be the tax impact. More info we needed, I think one of the things we talked about was like a maintenance schedule even for existing facilities, both new and existing facilities. We talked about, might we be in this position again 15, 20 years down the road, what are we doing as far as maintenance? I don't know.
And what did you choose an option?
B.
B is in both. Okay.
B
All right, so for option A, our pro was tax reduction. Our con was money spent on maintaining deteriorating structures. For option B, we had takes care of the 2 worst elementary schools as a pro. The con was needs a referendum to pass. Option C, our pro was most projects are taken care of, and our con on that was it's a lot to undertake in a short period of time. Information needed for all of them, we wanted to see a budget breakdown for each project to know where the money was going to be spent for each of these options. And our consensus was to go with option B.
Thank you.
Okay. Our option A was, obviously tax money back. Our con, was, well, we did the same spot that I did. B was, there was no tax increase, and the con was the long timeline. C was all the projects are completed. Our con was how disruptive it would be to staff and to students. More information needed was timelines for the pre-planned work, and we didn't come up with an option. We need more information.
Okay.
So option A doesn't displace the students. Cons, it's mandated, and it can wind up costing more money in the long term. Option B, it's better than doing nothing. The cons are the equities where some schools are getting this benefit, other schools aren't, but everybody's paying for it. Option C, everybody's included. The cons are it does displace the students. And then we went with more information needed with realistic and detailed timeline and the displacement plans and transportation plans for students. And we picked option C.
Thank you.
For option A, our pro was that it pushes major construction costs out for future residents to pay for. No renovation, the con is no renovations mean more maintenance costs each year. For option B, it doesn't take from other, the con, or the pro is, it doesn't take from the operating costs and fund balances. And the con there is that your taxes still will increase under the normal tax levy. On option C, the pro is almost all needs are covered. And the con is that due to a variety of factors, it doesn't necessarily mean that 2046 will be the end of bond payments. They may be pushed out past 2046 due to refinancing or whatever. We had a difference of opinion. One person chose option A, 3 people chose option B, and we also said we needed more information on the actual cost to complete the option on each school for under option C, and then also is what will actually be done in those schools that are not completely rebuilt.
Thank you.
We had a lot of what everyone else already said. For option A, a pro was no displacement of students. A con would be putting off the inevitable that it would be difficult to increase our taxes in a later date. Option B, we thought maybe that might have a higher chance of passing it as a referendum than C would. The con would be all the sunk costs of displacing the students and what would that mean and look like. Option C, a pro would be for new schools. A con is the uncertainty of increasing construction costs. More information needed. A lot of what you guys have already said was more specifics on how funds is going to be allocated in the future. And for task 3, we're not sure, but we're no A, but we don't know about B or C. We want more information in the end.
Thank you.
A lot of repeats, tough to get at the end. Option A pro is that it will address safety and security issues. A con, we might not be attracting new families to the area if our schools are in such disrepair, but we are is some of the higher tax rates in the area. Option B, Pro, it may allow us to defer some construction costs until they're not, maybe to correct a little bit, not all at historic highs. Con, it sort of seems like AGS and JVN might be deferred indefinitely if a bump in the road, like the recession occurs. Pros for option C, all schools get their upgrades and improvements. Con, again, just has to do with the historically high construction costs. Are we getting the best bang for our buck? Additional information needed, we all agreed. I just want to reiterate, we want to know how, when, which school, what's the priority list, but also what is being done to mitigate the risks of another crisis like the recession. How are we going to bomb-proof ourselves so we're not having the same discussion after another incident like that? We kind of agreed we need more information to give A, B, or C. Well, we all agreed in a way, but B and C kind of depend on what that looks like.
Thank you.
We're trying to find some new ground here, but a lot of them are competing. The Pro and A are the negative costs to the taxpayers, and would have the least public resistance because they don't have to do anything. The cons would be lower property values as the schools keep deteriorating, and it's really just delaying the inevitable for 5 years. We're still back here 5 years from now. For option B, the con would be, or the pro would be that if we delay J.B. Nelson and Dallas Gustafson, are we going to end up with higher construction costs by waiting? Or somebody suggested maybe we even have lower construction costs, but that's an unknown. The cons for option B would be the displacement of students, and everybody's going to feel different about that, being housed in a trailer all day long or whatever it ends up being. Option C, it treats all sides of town equally, so nobody feels gypped or overburdened, because all the schools are being addressed. The cons would be that because it requires a tax increase, your public resistance is going to be higher when it's time for a referendum. And anybody who's lived around here for a while knows that there's a lot of resistance sometimes. What we want to know is, we also highlighted the timeline. We'd like to know somewhere along the line, you have to pick an order that you do things. Is the maintenance building going to be done first or last? Is the high school going to be at the head of the list or at the back of the list? And that's probably important depending on where you're living or what your schools are. And we'd like to know what the plan is for addressing an increase of costs of construction or interest rates or whatever. How would these, I think the best thing would be to say, give a series of what ifs. What if this happens, then what does it do to the plan? And we were unanimous on option C.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, we pretty much got everything that everyone else said, but option A, savings and taxes, cons, just maintaining the status quo. Pros for option B, no increase in taxes, cons, exclude some schools, especially probably in areas that there is lower value there. Option C, only single phase, but a con is the displacement of students, and I think that's something, especially with the students that have been going through, they've already dealt with the crisis, so how much more can we put on the students? And that really has to be thought out, because they've been moved around, and now we're going to put them in a box. So I just think the mental aspect of these young children, that plan should be really thought about, and what other funding are we going to do for them, because I think it will happen. And then what I need to, or what we need to know more about is the details and the timeline, and that's really what, to make an informed decision. Right now it's option B, and for our table, option C is, I would love, I have a child here, I would love state-of-art, education, but they're STEM, and I just wanted to know what exactly we're planning for future generations.
Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Just listening to you and the thought that you put into it, I think is great discussions tonight. This is really what we want to happen in this process, getting everyone engaged and involved, so thank you very much for that. The next meeting will be on March 10th. We'd love to see everybody there. Bring your friends, neighbors, everybody else. I don't know, anybody after going through this experience, I know we already asked a little earlier, quite a few people are repeat, but do you plan on coming back? Raise a hands maybe, just to kind of give us an idea if we think of space and where to put it. Okay, awesome. Great, well, thank you again for everything. We can pick everything up and take care of it, but thank you for your time, really appreciate it. Yeah. High level content of the next meeting is more of the specifics. A lot of the stuff you were asking about, like hearing more details about the plan and stuff like that. I don't know that. I'll have to ask. I do not know if there's specific costs.